Hello everybody, welcome back to lecture 2 of conflict management. This lecture is called Back in the Day. As you can see from the PowerPoint there, we're going to follow along with the slides again. This lecture is all about how we came to be where we are now in the field of conflict management. Okay, so you ask yourself a question. How most people manage conflict is ingrained in them, and it's ingrained in everybody in a very similar way. So where did we learn this method of conflict management? The people who taught us conflict management through life experiences and schooling and that sort of thing, where did they learn it from? And where did the people that taught them learn it from? How come we've all got the same natural inclinations in conflict management, the same approach? Well, the answer to all those questions is the adversarial system. It's a very posh way of saying how things are right now. And we're going to go into a little bit of history about how things are right now. And the reason for that is that we need to know what it is that we're dealing with currently and set a starting point like we would in a coaching exercise. So we know where the point of origin is, and then from here we can map out our journey to getting to where we want to be, a different way of handling and managing conflicts. So in modern society, and particularly in developed countries like ours, we deal with disagreements by using a court-based system. So what happens is two lawyers will offer their arguments to a third party, and that system didn't come about by accident. The thing about this system is it's based on the assumption, though, that there always has to be a winner and a loser. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The thing with there being a winner and a loser is that system transfers across into our day-to-day lives, how we handle conflict between ourselves, with our family members, with work colleagues, not just in the court system. So where did the adversarial system come from? Well, to get to the origins of the adversarial system, we have to look back to the ancient Greeks, and that would have been around the 6th century BC. The background there is that back then, most cities and communities were at war for at least half of every year, and there'd be huge cost and damage and loss of life to resolve disputes. So they got to the point where they thought, we've got to get a better way of doing this, and they decided that it would be good to replace physical combat with verbal combat. No, I'm using the word combat there, though. So what essentially would happen is the two sides of an argument would argue their case, and a third-party arbitrator would make the decision as to what was right and what was wrong. Interestingly, that's where the democratic system comes from that we currently have in our political sphere. You've got the two opposing sides who argue out their points of view, and in this case, the arbitrator is the voting public. So on the screen now, I've got a chap called Aristotle. I'm sure you've heard of him. His idea that he brought to bear was the theory of, the principle of non-contradiction. What he said was a thing cannot be and not be at the same time. It sounds fairly straightforward, but what essentially that did is it channeled the adversarial system into a binary system. So there had to be a winner and a loser, a right and a wrong. As that system became more established, the equivalent of university scholars back then, or sophists as they were known, started to teach rhetoric and disputing or debating in universities and around Greece. And they moved on and developed a principle that the truth of a matter should be tested by both sides putting their argument before a third party. Now, the thing about that was something quite interesting came to pass, because students of Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato both argued that this system promoted people just wanting to win at all costs, as opposed to seeking out the truth. So if you think of it this way, you only have to listen to true crime podcasts to know that even with the system that we've got today, which is obviously developed and evolved all the way through from the system that they had back then, the motivation often is to win, not to find the truth of a matter. That's why there's so many wrongful convictions. The thing is, Aristotle argued back, and he said, well, okay, if the truth of a matter or if one person's on the side of the truth, then that person will have a much easier time presenting facts that back up his or her perspective than the person who's not on the side of the truth. So the truth will win the day. Well, I'll let you make your own mind up whether that always is the case or not. The thing is, if we're stuck with the adversarial system, we should really learn how to use it properly and how to navigate our way through it. And then we can take the principles that we learn, or the elements of the adversarial system, and learn how we can change those elements to be better conflict managers in our day-to-day lives now. So let's have a little look at the adversarial system. The first point I want to talk about is forensic reasoning. Now, in a dispute, there's a general principle, if you like. And that principle is that it's either a law, you shouldn't murder somebody, you shouldn't steal something, whatever the law might be. Or there's a general principle of fairness, like someone would be aggrieved that you've done this or that because it's considered by the community as a whole as unfair, as a principle. And what happens is the process of forensic reasoning takes place. So in the case of a court of law, two lawyers will face each other across a court, and they'll put their facts in front of the jury. One side's facts will prove that the general principle has been breached or transgressed against, and the other side will defend and say, no, that hasn't happened, that's not the case. So they're trying to show that there either has or hasn't been a breach of the general principle or law. So I'll give you an example. Imagine somebody's been murdered. The prosecutor comes along and they put the accused in the dock, and they say, I'm going to sit you in front of a presiding judge, and I'm going to present my physical evidence. There's a gun, there's bullet cases, there's footprints, and I'm going to call experts just to look at the physical evidence that I can put before you, like in my illustration there, the bullet entry point on the skull, or whatever it might be. So they put their evidence in front of the court. So they're holding that evidence up against the principle. Here's my evidence, and the principle is you shouldn't murder. Then you have the defending lawyer, who says, okay, I'm going to present my facts that show the person couldn't have been there. They weren't the last person to see the deceased alive. The gun hasn't got my client's prints on it. Whatever the evidence might be. And then the jury, in our example, will hold that evidence up against the principle and see which facts hold most weight, and come down and decide where the truth of the matter lies. That's basically what we call forensic reasoning. The second element in a situation like this is recognizing the issue, and that's not as straightforward as it sounds. You might find, for example, I'll give you another example, that somebody is accusing you of unfair treatment in the workplace. So they might say, you've given my colleague a more favourable work assignment than you gave to me. And they bring that to you and they pitch it at your door and say, you've treated me unfairly. You've favoured my colleague, say. But is that actually the issue? Or is there an underlying issue, like a real issue, where they actually feel that you favour their colleague generally? They feel inferior to their colleague. Perhaps you and their colleague went to the same college, so he or she sees an affinity between the two of you and feels left out or feels aggrieved in some way, that there is an underlying issue of status. There's an underlying status problem in the team. So it's not just the redistribution of the task problem that we've just looked at. And if you go about addressing that conflict as just that redistribution of the task issue, yes, you've potentially solved the issue on the day, but you haven't recognized the underlying problem, which is going to fester away. And again, that's part of the adversarial system, because you need to recognize where the real issue lies and where which principle has been breached. So is it that it's just an unfair distribution of work, or is it a more general principle that you run the whole team in a way that gives too much status or not enough status to individuals? Okay. Another skill is recognizing the starting point. So a conflict starting point is recognizing what would be the case if the underlying issue had never come to pass. So in our example I've just given there, the starting point wasn't that you distributed the work unfairly. It was way before that. It was perhaps when the new colleague started and you clearly showed some more affinity towards that person than the previous colleague. Perhaps that's where the starting point was. It's important to recognize the starting point, because only then can you move the conflict back in time and tackle the real issues. The next one I want to talk about is credibility of evidence. If you have a look at the slide there, we've just given an example previously of a court of law, and two different sides of an argument are pitching their evidence in front of a jury. The thing is, by definition, if I pitch a fact in front of the jury that proves that somebody murdered somebody, and the defendant pitches another fact that proves that that person couldn't have been the murderer, one of them has to be inaccurate. So one of those sets of evidence or facts has to have its credibility checked. And that's a common event in a court of law. It's not perhaps something that you would think to do, though, in an informal setting, but it's equally valid. So if you just think about that, if you go barreling into an argument, presenting your evidence that you feel as either defends or accuses the opposition, think about that term a bit later, of either being unfair or something, it's very easy to not recognize that the information that you're putting forward might have a few holes in it, because you're surely going to pick apart the other person's evidence, or you should be, if that's how you're going to deal with the adversarial system properly. Your opinions, your strongly held opinions in an argument setting, should be subject to the same scrutiny as if it were evidence that you were putting before a court. So it's worthwhile sort of sitting back and thinking, what is my motivation in this situation? Is it just to be right? Is that what I'm looking for here? I can think of an example in my career. So years ago, I used to be a team leader for a large enforcement team for a government organisation. And it was in the field of public health. And we used to prosecute people for breaches of legislation. Now, I used to mentor and teach less experienced enforcement officers how to gather evidence and how to present that evidence in a brief to a court of law. I was really surprised at how often I had to labour the point that the object of the exercise wasn't to win at all costs. The object of the exercise wasn't to get a guilty verdict. The object of the exercise for us was to present the evidence that we'd gathered completely, thoroughly, and fairly, and then allow the court process, the magistrate or judge or however we were presenting the evidence, or whatever level of court, let them make the decision of where the weight of evidence led them. The performance of us as a team wasn't measured on our rates of convictions or numbers of convictions, or it shouldn't have been. It was on how well we collected the evidence and how thorough we were. The thing is, human nature is such that you push yourself to achieve the outcome that you think you want. And it's worth just pulling yourself back a little bit in the heat of the moment and saying, what is my motivation? Am I trying to bury this person? Am I trying to win this argument? Or am I trying to get to the truth of the matter? And that's a concept that we'll pick up later in the course. So that's the adversarial system in a very general description. And it's one that we're stuck with. It's one that's been used in courts, and it's one that's been used in political elections, like I've already mentioned. But it has some significant downsides. And I think they're worth bearing in mind, because we don't want to be dealing with our conflicts in an adversarial approach. Later on in lectures 3, 4, and 5, I'll be talking about some social scientists and psychologists who've done a whole body of work into what approaches get the best results in managing a conflict situation. And surprisingly enough, the adversarial system and using the elements of approach that I've just described don't get you the best outcomes. So let's have a look at the downsides. The first one is, as we've already covered, because it's a them versus us situation, someone's got to lose. You can't come out of it with a positive result without someone feeling that they've completely lost the day. It also encourages you to see the other person as someone you're in conflict with or your enemy. It encourages a win-at-all-cost culture. So rather than a truth-seeking culture that we want to get to the actual truth of the matter and resolve this situation by doing that, it gives you this win-at-all-cost mentality. And like I said, there's so many wrongful convictions in the world that you can see that kind of has carried through right up to today. The thing is, winning and losing in the adversarial system is a very costly process, either in the cost of court fees and punitive measures, or in relationships and in loss of reputation and that kind of thing. So much so that large organizations who have libel claims pitched against them often decide to just settle with a cash payment out of court, even though they know they're right. Instead of fighting the battle to get to the truth of the matter, because the situation is such that the system is so expensive, they just write a check and get themselves out of it. Okay, so we've covered that in quite a bit of depth. I now want to just set you a little assignment so that we can, again, consolidate what we've learned. And I think that's going to be, again, you're going to pull out the notebook that you had before, from assignment 1, where we looked at our modus operandi in a conflict. Think about, at the start of an argument, how you arrived at your point of view for that argument, and what were the factors that went together to inform your point of view in that last argument that you can perhaps call to mind. Think about whether your opinion was the same at the end of the argument as it was at the beginning, and what facts and evidence you were pitching to make your point. And then I want you to really analyze, did you actually credibility check your facts and your data, if you like, when you were making the argument? And did you credibility check the logic that you were using? Or did you just barrel through the argument knowing that you were right from the outset? I think it's worth looking into. Then move on to have a look at the other person in the argument and see how much weight you placed on the information that they were bringing forward, and how heavily you scrutinized their evidence and the credibility of their evidence and the points they were raising. And then finally, think back to the last few conflicts you can remember again, and see if you actually got to the crux of the matter. Did you actually deal with the underlying issue and recognize the true starting point? Remember back to our office example. Or did you just deal with what was pitched to you at that time? Was the underlying issue that you kind of knew was there in the too hard basket? All right, good luck with that, and I'll see you in lecture 3.